honest,
Yeah.
I gotta say, I think Leotard might actually be one of my favorites.
No, he's a Ninja Turtle. Just kidding. Tell us about him.
He was one of the early theorists of postmodern theory. Kind of defined what the postmodern is using. He created one of the main definitions, which is an opposition to meta-narratives, or an opposition to grand narratives, kind of a breaking down of and fragmentation of kind of the grand moralistic narratives of the past that drove the conflict of the modern age.
Explain more about the historical narratives that prompted the crisis of the modern age, because that seems...
Well, what are the... I'm trying to remember... I don't remember the specific examples that that he used in his essay, but like Christianity would be a grand narrative. It's essentially just a narrative that argues that the world is as it should be, that the world is a certain way. So you have kind of the traditional grand narratives like Christianity, feudalism, but then even narratives like, but even things like capitalism, communism are grand narratives that they're narratives that are grounded in ideology, sort of. And when you, and even at a broader scope, even things like the idea of the establishment, or even science would be considered a grand narrative in a lot of ways.
Like
Interesting.
the man.
In the broadest sense, yeah.
Speaking
Whoever
of...
the man is.
what about you, Sarah? Who's your favorite critical theorist,
Yeah,
literary critic?
I guess I don't know if I have a favorite necessarily, but there are a pair of scholars that have been on my mind recently, and they are David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder. And what they did is they kind of outlined a theory of disability and deformity in literature, and how we kind of use like bodily abnormalities to illustrate thematic or narrative points. And they came up with the construct of what's called a narrative prosthesis, in that if you create a character who has a revenge narrative, you either need to show that revenge narrative through like characteristic interactions with that character, or you can show them as like not having a hand, and suddenly all of their ill feelings start making more sense. Or you can kind of make a shortcut. You're like, oh, this person is deformed, therefore they are seeking revenge.
So kind of the idea that the physical body is tied to the character of a person.
I would say
Yeah.
it can... I would guess that it can also go beyond just physical body to mental capability.
Yeah.
What with that being a primary plot device of, say, of Forrest Gump.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good example. And it's not even necessarily negative, like the kind of trope of the blind prophet. Like kind of this lack of being able to see in one realm gives you a better capacity to be able to see in another. And it is kind of, it is very much about bodies, but it's also very much about the able person's perception of abnormality. And physical abnormality and mental abnormality, and how we define that. So yeah, it's really interesting. What about you, Martin?
Who's your favorite critical theorist?
Well, I mean, there's so many to choose. One that I've recently gone back to after reading a paper that I used his book, The System of Objects, theorist named Jean Baudrillard. I was writing a paper about the death of the video rental store, and was talking about how it was an equalizer among classes. And it was 15 pages, and I had some cool diagrams, but really what I use Jean Baudrillard's theory for, which I really enjoy, is his elevation of the everyday object as more of a control sort of device, like a centering to a life. So, I mean, in any age, there's always some sort of object that is kind of superseding the entire life, be it, say, something in work that's taking precedence. I could think of maybe like a mill or a loom, or now it'd be like computers. But in my paper, I was focusing on the idea of going off of the object and how there's always going to be a steady stream, but it's the amount of space that object takes up in a life that kind of makes the object more important than the user of it, so like the human aspect. So in using that with the video rental store, like Blockbuster, Hollywood Video, they gave you the object, which was movies, games, M&Ms. It doesn't really work in this example, but they are good. And
Yeah, they are.
yes. And it was a steady stream because you're always going to have some sort of steady stream of external things in your life, but it was regulated by the amount you could rent, late fees, and the like, and just the actual physical being that it is a disc with a single cultural artifact on it. So in my paper, I also discussed how this system of objects has completely elevated to a very intangible force, and in the paper that was Netflix, or now any sort of streaming platform, in which there's no regulation to the consumption of that art or any media. I mean, even be it like commercials, like depending how long you watch, say Hulu or Amazon has commercials now, you're gonna get a steady stream, and there's really no off switch. Like that streaming device, that sort of mental stimulation.
It'll
visual
play
stimulation.
indefinitely, yeah.
Yeah, and doesn't even sometimes it doesn't even ask if you're still watching. So I was very fascinated by that and the sort of cultural ramifications, and then the class ramifications of this move away from this tangible video that everybody physically has to walk in the store to get. Everybody has to go through the exact same process to receive and then bring home and bring back, and it was a whole system. But now it's become, oh, if you go to someone's place and say you're trying to get your woo on and Netflix and chill, and say you don't have Netflix, that becomes a thing. And then if you have, oh, I subscribe to, say, HBO, Stars, every major network, YouTube Red, Amazon Prime, all of those, it suddenly elevates you in the eyes of perhaps others that also want to consume that same media, because you have so much access only based on wealth.
That
So-
actually makes a lot of sense.
It is interesting. I guess I don't really understand Baudelaire? Baudelaire? No, I'm thinking of a poet. What's his name?
Baudelaire.
Baudelaire's. I guess I don't really understand his theory. Can you outline that in like very simplistic terms so I can kind of see how you're
Yeah.
using him?
Essentially, there will always be sort of the progression of objects. You know, that has its own word. I forget now.
The
But
procession of images from are you talking are you referencing his theory of simulation and simulacra?
perhaps.
How it's like the progression of the image from a real image that has real representational value, and it keeps getting less quote unquote real until you have a hyper reality made up entirely of images.
Well, that would be more Benjamin.
Mm.
I'm speaking of Baudelaire. But they
Let me see if I could pull it up.
are similar in the fact that they're both concerned with the way that sort of everyday objects creates its own life around it, and how it becomes less about control and more about, say, a typewriter at the time controlling oneself.
Oh, so I guess, I mean, I kind of have to think about this in bodily terms, but like, we kind of use cars to get from point A to point B, but they kind of bend our bodies in weird ways, for
Exactly.
example.
Yeah,
Okay.
and how and each object that becomes more prominent demands more time as well as part of Baudelaire's theory.
Ah,
So yeah, like in the car example, those demand so much time, and even if you don't have a car, it becomes sort of this stigma
yeah.
of, oh, they don't have a car. So
Ooh, yeah, especially in America.
yeah, go
Um,
public transit.
Yeah.
So that's all I have. Thank you all for coming to this talk on literary criticisms and critics.
I mean, sorry, I just can never let anything die. Oh, it was about...